Hey, what's up, y'all? Matt MX is on the mic. So, yeah, let's just get right into it. You saw the video ranking the 2025 playoff series. So, the number 10 series is the Western Conference Finals between the Oklahoma City Thunder and the Minnesota Timberwolves. The Thunder won this series pretty comfortably in 5. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander took home the Western Conference Finals MVP. He had a very good series, which is to be expected from him. And then on the losing side of things, Anthony Edwards, he had a pretty solid series. I think my main issue with how he played was just his lack of three-point shooting. In the regular season, he had become an absolute sharpshooter, and that kind of disappeared during the Western Conference Finals specifically. I think the playoffs, he was generally very good. And, it's just, I think we're seeing with these matchups, even if you have a good shooting regular season, teams are going to force you to shoot it like that. So the number 9 series was a first-round matchup between the 3rd seed Los Angeles Lakers and the 6th seed Minnesota Timberwolves. So this series actually ended in an upset. The Timberwolves pulled off a pretty comfortable upset in just 5 games. So when you look at, why this was able to happen, there's, really one person who you really turn to and be like, yep, that's the reason. And it's Anthony Edwards. He just had an absolutely dominant series. And we saw it, last year versus the Suns, he did this, and then now he did it again this season versus the Lakers. This man just does not look at the odds. He just goes hard, and it leads to wins more times than it doesn't. Then if you look at the losing end, Luka Doncic, he had a pretty solid series. I think, Anthony Edwards did, outplay him ultimately. But Luka was generally consistent, and I think he was really the reason why the Lakers were even able to stay competitive in most of these games. So the number 8 series was also a first-round matchup, and this one was between the Indiana Pacers and the Milwaukee Bucks. So the Pacers, they ended up winning this series very comfortably in just 5 games. So, the Pacers, they had a very solid formula. Pascal Siakam, he was probably the best all-around player in majority of the games. But ultimately, when push came to shove, Tyrese Haliburton was there to hit the clutch shot every single time. We saw it in every single series, and this series, I think, was probably the big example of this. Where just basically you felt like, no matter what it was, Tyrese Haliburton was going to hit that big shot. And you look at the Bucks, Giannis, he did everything he could, but ultimately it just wasn't enough. And you have to wonder just how many of these early exits is Giannis Antetokounmpo going to tolerate before he starts talking about requesting a trade or something like that. I think it's a question worth discussing. But, for now, great job, Pacers. So now let's take a look at the number 7 series. This is the first series that went 6 instead of 5 games. So it was a second-round matchup between the New York Knicks and the Boston Celtics. The Knicks were able to pull off the upset in 6 games. And if you look at how they were able to do it, Jalen Brunson, of course, had to do a lot, as you'd expect. But it was more than just that. The Knicks got a lot of help from their others on the defensive end. I think the player seeing right now, Mikal Bridges getting that clutch block on Jason Tatum, that was a big play that really changed the momentum of the series. And overall, I think it's really just look into how the series went. The Knicks got a lot of big-time defensive plays from their role players and other players. And, if you look at the Celtics, Tatum, he really struggled even before the injury, and so that's why I don't even think the injury makes that much of a difference in the upset, and Brown did what he could. So next, it's the number 6 series, which was the Eastern Conference Finals. It was between the New York Knicks and the Indiana Pacers. So the Pacers were able to pull off an upset in 6 games to advance to the NBA Finals for the first time since the 2000 season when they had Reggie Miller. And of course, Tyrese Haliburton with his clutch shots was a very big factor in that. But he did not end up winning the Eastern Conference Finals MVP. That ended up going to Pascal Siakam. He had probably a better overall series, which is kind of was the theme throughout the Pacers playoffs. But ultimately, you do not win without Tyrese Haliburton. So yeah, if you look at the Knicks, they were expected to win this series. And really, outside of Brunson, they just did not get the production necessary to, kind of advance to the finals. And that's kind of what I was expecting to happen this series before, where it'd just be like Brunson and then nobody else. But, like I said, in that Celtics series, everyone stepped up for the most part. But in this series, we didn't necessarily see that. Now let's take a look at the number 5 series. So this one was a first round matchup. It was between the New York Knicks and the Detroit Pistons. So, the Knicks, they were the veteran team. They were expected to win. Even though the Pistons did well in the season series, it did end up being Knicks in 6, which I think is what most people expected. The series, in its defense, was very good. And Jalen Brunson, he showed off. He's one of the best point guards in the league, and I think he really did show that. And if you look at the Pistons, then they did show their youth in many aspects. But Cade Cunningham, he did show that he can compete with anyone, including Jalen Brunson. So I think the Pistons, they have a very bright future, and this was just a small showcase of what they're going to be able to do within the next couple seasons. They can take advantage of having these mix of youth and veterans under contract. But yeah, for now, the Knicks, they were able to win pretty comfortably off a great performance from Jalen Brunson. So let's take a look at the number 4 series. So this was a second round matchup. It was between the Oklahoma City Thunder and the Denver Nuggets. So of course, as the team looking to win the finals in 2025, you had to go through the last team to win a championship in the West, and that was the Denver Nuggets. And Nuggets, they showed their experience very early on. The Thunder, at times, within the first, I'd say, 5 games, they looked overwhelmed. But then, they really matured very quickly, and they were able to win. And, Shea got the best of the MVP matchup. He had an excellent series. He of course, had some help, but ultimately, Shea did step up big time. And, Jokic, to his defense, he did play very well. It was just a pure matchup, MVP versus MVP. Even though some of the games kind of ended up being blowouts, it was still nice to see those two kind of go head-to-head. And I think it did live up to the expectations in that aspect, that it was just, both of them played very well. So now let's take a look at the number 3 series. So this was a first-round matchup. It was between the Golden State Warriors and the Houston Rockets. So firstly, I found the first 4 games to be kind of dull. The Warriors really showed off their veteran poise. But then, the Rockets, they kind of adjusted. They won 2 games, Game 5, Game 6, and that forced a Game 7 when the Warriors were up 3-1. But luckily for the Warriors anyway, Curry, he had an excellent Game 7 this time, and that ultimately put the Rockets away again. He's done that a lot throughout his career. And for the Rockets, I really liked what Sengun did, even in the losing effort. And I think it makes sense to build around, him and KD. He ultimately traded away Jalen Green, who really struggled this series, in favor of Kevin Durant. And that could, of course, give them the veteran presence they need in order to advance past the Warriors and other veteran-led teams out west. For now, though, the Rockets showed their youth. So this is the number 2 series. It was a first-round matchup. It was between the Los Angeles Clippers and the Denver Nuggets. So, of course, the Clippers, they went into this season with no expectations, and they gave the Nuggets, a team that was expected to win a championship, an absolute big-time run for their money. But ultimately, the Nuggets pulled away in a blowout in Game 7, and that's really the reason this series didn't end up being the number 1 series, just for the simple fact that Game 7 was just such a blowout. It kind of just sucked the life out of the series. So when you look at the Nuggets, I in my notes, I literally just put Nikola Jokic. That says everything you need to know. And then for the Clippers in the losing effort, Kawhi Leonard, he was finally able to stay healthy for a series, but outside of really the first game, he just didn't feel like he was making the impact that he was. Of course, it's been a long time since 2019. He's dealt with a lot of injuries. Maybe you can't expect the same level of production. He was playing very well before that. It felt like he had finally been healthy. So now we go to the best series of last year's playoffs, and that is the NBA Finals. For the first time, I'd say, since 2016, arguably even before, the best series was the Finals. The Pacers, they went into there as massive underdogs, but they did their formula to perfection. They got the Halliburton big-time shots, Siakam's all-around effort, and they forced the Thunder to Game 7. And, Game 7, it ended up being somewhat disappointing with Halliburton, unfortunately, tearing his Achilles. But, the Pacers, they still fought. And that's really what makes that team great. They just never quit. Of course, I could talk about how tough the Pacers fought, but ultimately the Thunder did win the championship. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander takes home the Finals MVP. It's the second championship of the Thunder Supersonics franchise history. It's the first one since they moved to Oklahoma. They still get credit for that Seattle championship, ultimately.